All right, everyone. Thank you guys for tuning in, and welcome back to I guess this is the third or fourth consecutive Canis Society live stream. Today we will be talking about the first chapter in Thomas S. Hibbs' book, Nihilism. Sorry, Shows About Nothing, Nihilism in Popular Culture. If you've been keeping abreast of society postings on this particular channel, you would know that we have the first chapter recorded as an audiobook for you guys to listen to at your leisure. And if you have not done so, it's highly advisable that either you listen to that first, or if you didn't get the chance to catch it, after this stream would probably be a good time to go ahead and drop back and give it a listen. It's going to include portions of the prelude to that book, which we have gone over in the last live stream. However, it's probably a good idea to get a refresher on that information. Before I turn anything over to Andrew and have him sort of make his introduction for this stream, I do want to apologize that we have been basically negligent a month. We basically missed the last live stream, and that is because I had other prior obligations, and Andrew was not properly credentialed at the time, but he is now properly credentialed, and so we shouldn't have any problems in the future. Now, my own personal work situation is changing, so we will probably be relocating the stream to a different time in the week. But hopefully, we will continue going strong and continue working through Thomas Hibbs' fascinating book. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. Is there anything you'd like to say to the good folks?
Uh, Other than I'm going to be really low energy this time, comparative to my almost childlike exuberance in the last one. I'm going to be a bit slow.
That's unfortunate because this is one of those streams where you might need your childlike exuberance, and I can't supply it for both of us. Um, Before I press on any further, I would like to go ahead and ask if the people in the chat can hear or understand us. Is everything coming through clear? Is has the stream crapped itself already? What's our status? So I'm going to go ahead and throw that question out there before we get any further. And then I suppose I'll be leading the discussion on the first chapter of Shows About Nothing. And we're probably going to keep this a fairly short stream this week. And also because this is sort of the first stream where we have sort of all of our ducks in a row, so to speak, and we've got the audiobook out for people to listen to, and then the stream is sort of commentary on that. So this will help establish in people the understanding of how this works going forward. Um, I haven't seen anyone confirm or deny that the
I got
stream.
one.
You seeing one?
Mm,
Yep. All right.
just
Awesome.
ended. We're fine.
Excellent. So yeah, without further ado, I think I'm going to go ahead and dive into my discussion of it, and then Andrew, anytime you want to butt in, just go ahead. Unless you had some ideas that you wanted to lead with.
Yeah, I can kind of describe the chapter
Excellent. Go ahead.
very, very much in broad. Uh, but what we're doing with Hibbs starting off with is the first chapter is very much dedicated to a broad overview of the entire sort of project. So that's why he has to go over and saying, well, what is nihilism properly? What's some of its genealogy? Like, where did it come from? How does it progress? And then giving a kind of brief example of how he does that later on when he designates sort of three stages of liberalism as it progresses towards a kind of nihilism or allows it to emerge, where he designates each stage with a certain kind of film, and then does a brief exercise in sort of seeing here's how the film is able to represent it and so on and so on. So this is basically giving a kind of general philosophical background for laymen, basically, to be comfortable with some of the broad ideas, and then as we go along, it's further and further dissecting certain themes or attributes that he's linking in with nihilism in film. So like the next chapter is, I think, I'll just do a quick check here. He has the quest for evil, and that's when he's going to start talking about movies like The Exorcist or something like that. Uh, so this is really just a broad introductory overview and a little bit of history stuff.
Right. And I found also that the films he focused on, he did so to sort of talk about the sort of ethics or metaphysics undergirding certain Hollywood films, like in the very broadest terms.
Mm.
Do you think that that's fair to say?
Uh, a little bit. It's a little bit more complex than that.
Well,
Uh,
I
we're,
just mean by that I just mean like he's looking at It's a Wonderful Life and and the sort of general message or worldview of the film.
Yeah,
Um,
it's sort of he's using them almost like time capsules. If you look at A Wonderful Life, it's speaking of a particular kind of worldview
mm,
or ethics of a particular period, which is why he's using it as like this is the first stage of liberalism where ideas, where
I'm
the dignity
sorry,
of man and his rights.
you cut out there. This is the first stage of liberalism, you said.
Hold on, yeah, hold on. I'm gonna drop out and switch over to the app that usually fixes this.
Okay. Well, while he's gone, I have the stream all to myself. I will he's back already. It's probably a good thing.
That should help it.
Excellent.
Okay.
So yeah, your point was exactly.
Yeah. He's presenting these things as sort of like time capsules of a particular period. So actually, I've almost completely lost my train of thought. Shoot. This is in response to oh yeah, first stage of liberalism is what A Wonderful Life is supposed to correspond to,
Hmm.
where it's this idea that you have like it's a democracy, it's a republic, yada 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 yada, but it's rooted in this concept of the individual and his rights being nested in either nature or the god of nature. So it's this very Lockean concept. So
Right.
that's why you get, and he also uses it in To Kill a Mockingbird, where you have some sort of social problem here, but the hero or that individual is the one who's going to basically fix the problem. Is
Right.
kind of reinvigorating that society. So it's just kind of the problem emerges, but then as a kind of community, it fixes itself.
It's
Well, not
very
not itself.
much it's To Kill a Mockingbird is very much in that whole civil rights leader sort of community inclusiveness kind of problem solution paradigm.
Yeah, where it's you have the virtue of one individual sort of reinvigorating the whole moral order of that community. So it's very kind of a like a principle of subsidiarity. It's not this top-down kind of solution. It's actually this emergent from within,
Mm,
where the moral order kind of reasserts itself by good people acting, essentially. But it's presupposing that there is a moral order that it's supposed to correspond to.
correct.
Uh, and it's very like Hibbs is kind of saying not very too much, but he's kind of saying that it's a little bit idealistic, which is why he transfers into the second stage where he talks about the second stage of liberalism as self sovereignty or self governance, and he uses noir as that, where it's a bit more, let's say, mature in its presentation,
Mm,
where it's presenting flawed individuals in a very confusing world, where they actually have to try and sort its it's very confusing. They have to kind of feel their way out instead of this very simple solutions. It's flawed people trying to work in a flawed world to find their purpose, but uh, it's never sort of self-defeating. It just says it's difficult and confusing, but people working together are able to kind of get back uh, to any kind of moral order or solution to solve the mysteries of life. But that's where Hibbs really accentuates that it's noir has this kind of turn back to like the pre-modern conception of life as journey and life as mystery
mm,
at one and the same time. Like he makes a quote about the city itself as kind of a character. Uh, the audio recording didn't catch it, but it's actually highlighted when it says amazement. It literally highlights the word maze. The city is a maze, kind of representing the confusion of life and the difficulty as individuals trying to navigate that, which is why it requires community of some sort to help feel it out of flawed individuals going through life.
Yeah, I really like the whole idea of the flawed individual as uh, sort of the focus of noir films because everyone if you know anything about noir films, the thing that most people remember, right, is the femme fatale, the woman who usually comes in at the beginning and has this problem, and as the detective goes through the quest of trying to figure out who killed who or whatever the case usually is, it's usually revealed that this female character is in some way like involved or morally compromised in some way by her um, proximity to the case, and one of the things you get with the movies, these noir films, is that it's very rarely like ambiguous that to turn her in or to distance yourself from her or remove yourself from any kind of relationship with her is the correct response for the detective to take. The only like the only problem is, of course, we understand that the detective is a human being, so there's obviously there's the lust component involved. It's usually an attractive woman, and so yeah, I think that's really on the nose, just what I
Hmm.
happen to know about noir films,
Yeah,
because
it's
yeah.
yeah, it's a little bit more of a mature uh, example of what it would be like to live in a kind of choose your own destiny kind of culture. That this kind of transition from like, well, I'm born into a blacksmith family, so then I'm in a blacksmith. Things are kind of a bit more rigid categories. Here you have that enlightenment in turn of saying, no, it's up to you. It's your own self governance and your own self sovereignty. But then when you do that, you sort of put the pressures back on the person. So then life gets more confusing. It's like the Soren Kierkegaard famous quote of anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. So then you have the flawed individuals trying to work their way through life. And that's why you get the quote of there's two mysteries in a noir film. There's the murder mystery, but there's also the mystery of the woman. So
Right.
it's the mystery of your problems immediately at hand, and then the mystery of other people, and trying to work out that kind of engagement. Like again, straight from the book, talking about that you're not just trying to solve a murder mystery; it's also the mystery in quest to try and find love, communication, uh, and like true human interaction between people. So that's why you get like I think he uses
Well,
Casablanca.
yeah, that's Casablanca.
Yeah, you start off with this very aloof kind of I'm a loner, I don't want to be with anyone, but then it's this coming out of that kind of a atomized disposition as the human person seeks actual communication and relationships with others. And then you then you get at the end that kind of tongue in cheek. This is a beginning of a wonderful relationship or something like that.
Hmm.
That tune, and that's the overcoming, but it's never naive or childish or overly idealistic about it. It's saying, no, there's a struggle here and there's a lot of confusion that has to be overcome first to be able to do it. But it does say at the end of the day, it's possible and that's what you have to do. So
Right.
it's mildly existential to some degree.
But yeah, I really like that because like you said, there's a tension. That's the thing about noir films, is that there's a tension where everybody would understand if the detective or the main character in the film did the wrong thing. So in Casablanca, for example, it would be running off with uh I can't remember a lady's name, but you know who I'm talking about. Um, uh, but at the same time, the film does not treat this as if the film never treats it as if the wrong thing and the right thing are like two valid courses of action. It's always very clear in noir films that like doing the selfless or the altruistic thing is the correct thing to do. Um, so in that way, um, yeah, they're sort of well, like you said, they sort of reestablish this through this enlightenment filter. They sort of reestablish the whole idea of life as a journey or a quest.
Hmm. Right, and then the final stage that Hibbs outlines, or I guess transition. I don't think he's ever saying that this is
Hmm.
necessarily where it goes. At least Hibbs himself different conversation to argue if it really does, like by its own internal logic. But his last phase is aesthetic self creation, and he goes to train spotting to do that, and he presents that. I think it's the opening dialogue where it ends
Hmm.
with like, I'm gonna reject all of this stuff about like getting a job, living your life basically normally, buying stuff, have a family, etc., etc. I'm going to say no to all these things, and instead I'm going to choose heroin. Why? I don't need a reason. Who needs reasons when you have heroin? So it's this kind of, in fact, an entire break from any kind of like it's a flattening of choices. Everything is kind of held into equivalent, and it's presenting doing heroin is actually equivalent to doing all these sort of quote unquote normal things. And there's no real means of distinguishing which is higher or the lower of the two. So it's playing about that with a little bit, and it's in fact this self creation where all choices are kind of held in common to one degree or another in a soft relativism.
Right. I think one more thing I could say is that he also talks a little bit about sort of 20th century romanticism in film,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
he gives the specific examples of E.T. and Avatar. I know Avatar is
Mm-hmm.
technically 21st century, but you guys get off my case. Um, uh, but in E.T. it's not subtle, but it's a little bit well, it's a little bit less on the nose than Avatar, and so I think you see how as time goes on, the sort of romantic response gets uh, a little bit more opaque, I guess, a little bit stronger, and I think a lot of that has to do with piggybacking off of the environmentalist movement.
Mm-hmm.
But and it is worth talking about the strain of romantic thought in American film. Well, the way he talks about ET, right? ET, this alien, he can make flowers grow, and he's peaceable, gets along well with children, and he has a glowing his chest glows where his heart is, and all of these sort of you know
And he communicates primarily with children, and it's
right.
this he's the innocence of nature, this kind of uh like a return to a more simpler time. It's this idealistic notion.
Right, and then the bad guys in the film are like government scientists. They come in,
Hmm.
hazmat
Yeah,
suits and
the cold practical reason of modern society versus the innocence of nature and the simplicity of childhood. These are what's contrasted in the film,
mhm. and
and it's raising one above the other very clearly.
right. And now that is like he says, it's very that ET is a more classical or classically romantic portrayal, specifically when it comes to the primacy and the importance of childlike innocence and the childhood experience. So he throws out people like Wordsworth and maybe William Blake. I'm not sure, but William Blake is definitely. William Blake had a series of poems called The Songs of Innocence and Experience. And the thing that he does in the Songs of Innocence and Experience is specifically to juxtapose sort of the innocence and necessary goodness of the child with the sort of jadedness of adult experience. Um, for example, he has these two sort of connected poems. Both I think are titled "The Chimney Sweep," and one of them is a description of the sort of death that children who were chimney sweeps in 18th century and 19th century England would have experienced from black lung and related health issues. And he portrays it as a dream where angels come and ferry these dead children off to heaven, basically. Whereas in the poem that is supposed to be from the perspective of the adult, it's more about how the parents have basically abandoned their child to be a chimney sweep. So it's the same theme. Poems have the same title, but it juxtaposes sort of how children can. Uh, children have this inherently good, inherently innocent way of viewing the world, as opposed to adults. So, E.T. is tapping into that classical strain of romanticism that goes back to the early 19th century. Um, Whereas something like James Cameron's Avatar is much more romanticism for the modern era because of course it emphasizes nature rather than sort of the goodness
Yeah,
of
it's
childhood.
doing this kind of, and I find it very obscene. It's this kind of romanticism of it's the noble savage thing
Yeah,
that
that's what
that
it
we're
is.
very familiar with. It's this kind of it's very awkward where it's like the city dwelling modern then projects upon a fantasy on like the Native American tribes or something, and then it's like they'll dance in amazement when they do their ghost dance or something like that, and then sort of offshore their own problems onto them, and almost like vampires use the fantasy they projected on them to kind of reinvigorate themselves. And you
Mm,
kind of see that on display in Avatar, where it's just we're inventing what is something basically nonsense as a kind of balm for an issue to help us almost ignore a little bit this sort of fantasy of returning to nature, but then at one and the same time not leaving the modern behind. It's a kind of plague of fantasy. Uh,
right. I remember when I saw the film and I said to myself, "This is just cowboys and Indians in space," because
yeah,
I've seen this a million times.
yeah. Everyone's made the comparison with dances with wolves. That's it.
Yeah, and these are films. It almost seems like these are films meant to kind of indulge people in an alternate history where science and progress trademark haven't just destroyed mankind's relationship with nature, because of course the Navi literally are just
Yeah, yeah.
avatars for
And then they're literally communing with nature. Nature. They take their ponytails and plug it into trees and all
Mhm.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so, but to differentiate it from ET, right? Okay, I won't go into certain things about ET, but in general, Avatar is much more like explicitly sexual in its presentation, um, which is interesting, and I think I think it's I don't think that the romantic films that center on childhood or the childhood experience are going to be what's dominant in that strain of romantic filmmaking in the 21st century. I think the 21st century is much more akin or is much more interested in a more mature kind of romanticism, if that makes any sense.
Hmm.
Because I think I don't think actually that uh, people in the 21st century have any kind of desire to return to a childlike state of innocence.
No,
Um,
it's a total. It's really a simulacra where it's they have an image or a fantasy in their head that is basically made up of a bunch of stereotypes of different stories
mm,
and things, but it's so removed from what it actually is, the actual referent.
mm,
This is kind of what Hibbs is talking about, where romanticism itself can actually bring forth a kind of nihilism where you go, oh, my fantasy, this romantic image I have of such a thing, isn't actually real, but I've fallen in love with that image.
mm,
So it's like then if you actually did return to nature, like if you actually do go out into the forest and like build a cabin there, it's not Dances with Wolves. It's just not. And then like when you actually obtain the object of your desire here, the object of your fantasies, it's incredibly banal because you fell in love with an image in a fantasy. So then that's why Hibbs is a very careful not to say it's not this. He does say romanticism has a way to overcome nihilism, as it's able to bridge, or what is it, raise up certain kind of uh, spiritual components, and helps in that regards as an art form. But then at one and the same time, you have this kind of problem of fantasy and
Hmm.
having that overturn the real to a certain degree. So he's being very careful about it, where you don't fall in love with fiction. It's something to kind of help you move through it.
Yeah, it's in some sense it sort of reveals a weakness in modern storytelling because if you take someone from sort of a pre-modern context, you might say, they're under no illusions, right, that if they tell a fable or some sort of traditional folk story, like they're under no illusions that this is a real story that describes reality, because that's not the purpose of a story like that. Um, Whereas I think modern people kind of have this problem where they want to use narrative structures to impose certain things, like on reality itself, rather than drawing from reality to, create these sort of traditional narratives that we have, floating around. Like there's a reason why, for example, a lot of fairy tales in different countries are very similar, because they're all drawing from the same similar pools of sort of like collective folk wisdom. Whereas in the modern world, in terms of filmmaking, for example, it's the reverse, right? America creates a particular culture that has a particular ideological way of viewing reality, and the purpose of the story is to impose a certain understanding of reality. Um, to impose a certain understanding of the world onto reality, rather than rather than just describing something archetypally or metaphorically, or whatever these old folk stories might have done. So I don't know if you think that's a helpful distinction, but I think that's something that can be drawn out of Hibbs's work.
Hmm. Well, what that kind of is touching on a little bit of the postmodern condition, where it's the separation between the representation and the referent. We're referring to what is it, the copies. So it's copies of copies of copies. This is just Baudrillard. So now it's simply self-referential. It never actually touches base with anything in the real. Like, this is something that you'll start finding in movies. Something like what's the name? What's the name of the film? I'm blanking on it. It's Ready Player One, I think.
Hmm.
I think it where like there's just a whole bunch of pop culture references, so it's just self-referential and it never actually touches with anything. It's sort of that, and this is what Frederick Jameson's in his book on postmodernity writes that he sees on the, like, I think he wrote it back in the 80s, and he basically predicts cultural production in the postmodern world, where it's simply going to be self-referential, reinventing things that's already been there, and just copies of copies of copies, because it just never touches base with anything. But at the same time, can't look forward to the future because of, and this is a term I'm referencing someone else, but it's a slow cancellation of the future. So it's like being stuck in time, just frozen, but then continually recycling things, trying to make the old new again. But the old never touches base with anything. So that's where you get this kind of, okay, we have to create a narrative and slap it on top of reality, this reality that we've lost touch with to certain degrees because of this liquidity, where we can't pin anything down to essences anymore. A tree isn't just a tree anymore. There's always this underlying skepticism. Uh,
Right.
and this is sort of a long talk of about movements of from like the pre-modern to modern to postmodern, all this kind of stuff. I'm trying to blow through it as quickly as possible, but it's this incredulity to meta narratives and this inability to pin things down epistemically, leaving everything kind of in this flux of skepticism and uncertainty, and then trying to wash it over with this self-referential balm. So that is sort of what you're describing here.
still with us?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, and it's Hibbs actually brings up the example of Twilight New Moon, where one of the things he talks about is how the main character acts as if this is his wording specifically. She acts as if, um, she's in some sort of dramatic, meaningful struggle, and she puts herself in all these sorts of dangerous situations. Not necessarily wanting to die, but basically thinking that if her life was going to end, that it should end in some way that could be construed as more or less meaningful. And I think that's sort of the termination point of what you were just discussing, what we've been discussing in this live stream, is that, like you said, everything becomes so self-referential, and these works of art are sort of, in some sense, trapped in themselves. That there is no penetrating out and finding something real. So,
Mhm.
for a character like Bella What's Her Face in Twilight, um, you know, um, uh, she's stuck with this problem of she has to act as if, which of course nothing is real. In the Obviously the film is not real because it's a film, it's not reality. But even within the context of the film, nothing is real. Um, or maybe that's too far, but.
Mhm. No, but you are touching a little bit on something where she's trying to rediscover this passion. It's a passion for the real, by thrusting herself into these kind of like over exhilarating events. This thing about danger. Like Hibbs actually also references like a line from I think the Goo Goo Dolls song.
Mhm.
Sometimes you want to bleed just to know you're alive. It's that kind of thing. It's something. This is concrete and real. Or like I believe it's in a Clockwork. No, it is in a Clockwork Orange, but I'm pretty sure it's Alex DeLarge, and I'm pretty sure I'm getting the quote right. It's a blood isn't real until you vidi it on the screen, kind of kind of thing. So it's this desire for the real, but then there's this break. You just can't ever touch it. Uh, so it's kind of constant flinging, but at the same time alienation from. So it's this kind of hovering period, and then that's kind of the result of a kind of milieu of nihilism. Everything's kind of held in common, but there is this drive for the real to kind of get back in touch with it. But now it's sort of going back to like this noir concept. It's a maze, and it's very difficult to get back.
Mhm.
And that's why Hibbs also notes that this is why romanticism can be give way to nihilism, where if you try to just have the naive notion of we can just go back, put the genie back in the bottle, no, you'll never get there. You're going to frustrate yourself and give up, which is why you have to kind of go through it and find an overcome it of it.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things I was going to try to get done in this live stream is I had a theory I was going to float that's related to this chapter, and then there's one more thing I wanted to touch on, and then I think maybe we'll take questions and call it a day, unless there's something else you wanted to discuss.
Hmm.
Sound good?
Yeah.
So, when I was listening over the first chapter, one of the things I was thinking of is he's sort of giving a chronology or a genealogy of the sort of encroaching nihilism in American cinema. He spends a lot of the prelude talking, for example, about Woody Allen films. Um, but when I thought about nihilism in film, when I was thinking about one of the things that I thought of was I believe it's the 58 film version of A Streetcar Named Desire, which is a Tennessee Williams play. And it's pretty closely adapted from the play. Obviously, things are changed because film and theater are not exactly, they're very different forms of art. But, there's just this, it's interesting to see what was going on the stage, and then when it gets transposed into film it's much different than other films of the era, especially stuff like this especially stuff like the Frank Capra films that he's talking about. Um, and so, I'll talk a little bit about Streetcar Named Desire for those that aren't familiar. So, the basic story of A Streetcar Named Desire is that there is this woman who lives in New Orleans with her husband, Stella Kowalski. She lives with her husband, Stanley. Stanley is portrayed as being sort of your stereotypical alpha male. He goes out bowling with his friends, and he's depicted as being sort of a womanizer, and he lives in this apartment with Stella and Stella's sister, Blanche Dubois, who is down on her luck, comes to stay with them in their apartment. And the main conflict of the film and of the play, or the main tension, I suppose, is whether or not Stanley and Blanche are going to consummate an adulterous affair. And in the end of the film, spoiler alert, there is this sort of in the play. It's actually quite visceral. In the film, it's a little bit more tame, but there is a rape scene, and uh, after that, um, after that in the film anyway. Yeah, people remember A Streetcar Named Desire for the famous Stella quote. But anyway, in the film, Blanche gets carted off to the loony bin. I can't remember exactly what happens to her in the play, but she's removed from the situation. And this is actually an interesting bit of Hollywood trivia, is that this was a film that was made during the days of the production code. So certain elements of the film that they wanted to include from the play they couldn't. Like, for example, in the play, and this is interesting because this is kind of what I want to talk about. In the play, it's very clear that Stella believes that Stanley actually did rape Blanche. However, um, it's that's clear in both the play and the film. However, she's able to keep up sort of plausible deniability. She doesn't want to believe it, so she refuses to believe it, and in the end, she goes back to living with Stanley. And so the whole, you know, the whole play and the movie itself also are about lust, and about how there are these strictures in society that at the end of the day are really just very flimsy very flimsy barricades to people getting what they want. And this is evident in the character of Blanche Dubois, who sort of is depicted throughout the film um, as using her ability to manipulate people to get what she wants in terms of like clothing and jewels and money, but also male attention. And um, she doesn't actually care um, what happens to the people that she's involved with. Most famously, her husband. When she discovers that her husband is in a homosexual relationship, she confronts him about it, and this causes him to commit suicide. And she's not particularly remorseful about it. Um, I think I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but what I want to get back to is there is this underlying idea in the film and in the play which is especially symbolized by Stella going back to Stanley at the end of the play, and then at the end of the film, it's not explicitly stated that she goes back to live with him, but it's sort of implied. The fact that she is able to believe what she wants about what occurred between Stanley and Blanche, um, and that she is able to continue having this sort of this very high libidinous relationship with Stanley, is evidence that in the universe of the setting, the main driving factor is the character's, like as the title would suggest, desire. That's the one overriding thing that all the characters have in common, and that's the thing that, so to speak, is making the balls of matter hit each other and bounce off, because this is a fundamentally animalistic, materialistic setting. So that being said, that's a way of viewing the world that does not, and I'm not saying necessarily that Tennessee Williams believed that. I'm just saying that that's the sort of underpinning of the story. And that's the sort of thing that you could get very easily on the stage. Another example would be something like, well, I can't, I'm blanking on the name, but it's Death of a Salesman. That's what I'm trying to think of. So, Death of the Salesman also deals with the sort of emptiness at the bottom of the American dream and how it drives people to despair. But you see, you have these kinds of stories that can be told on the stage, and they, over time, things like that start to bleed into cinema. But they're coming in. Cinema is not necessarily the thing that's breaking ground. It's, other forms of art, and cinema sort of mops it up all like a sponge. And I think that's as true with nihilism in popular culture, so to speak, as with anything else. And I know uh, uh, that wasn't a particularly like um, poignant insight, but that was an insight nonetheless. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Oh, I stepped away a little while ago to go deal with my dog. You went and did it at just the right time, so I could quietly go do that.
All right, well, fair enough. Well,
No,
I get
I think what was it? The gist of it is that you get a kind of interaction between plays in cinema.
correct.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
the
it's just Hibbs being like writing for a very popular audience, and that's why he's using very popular films to describe it.
mhm.
But no, you can absolutely extend this analysis and go back to plays and find the exact same thing. I mean, you find like the early existentialists were writing plays, sort of giving uh, the, the narrative expression of what they were talking about. Like I'm
Right.
pretty
Well,
sure it was like
I
Camus was
think
a playwright. I'm pretty sure.
yeah, I think the medium of the theater, which is related to film, is sort of the avenue, I think, by which a lot of nihilistic thinking intrudes into cinema. And I also think it's as a medium, it's the refuge for the sort of high nihilism, or really frank explorations of nihilism, with something like, say, Waiting for Godot.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Oh no, I would say that plays are far more. Shoot, I'm blanking on it, but it's that's where you get a lot more of this experimentation because
mhm.
it's more of a high art form versus movies. They're still in this kind of mid area of they can be high art at times when it's like art house films or something like that when it's in black and white, no audio or something. Uh, but it's still this very you know uh, generalized form of entertainment versus plays are still kind of in a little bit of a niche and they can still do this their high art for plays.
Right. One last thing I wanted to hit, and then I'll turn it back over to you. Well, actually, I'm the thing I wanted to do was ask you a question, because I think it would benefit me and the audience. Um, so he spends a lot of the last part of the first chapter talking about voluntarism and nominalism, and how these lead to nihilism. Specifically, he's talking about Hobbes and Descartes. And
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on on
Okay,
that.
so this is something that you it's a little bit of a narrative
Mm,
or sort of an account of history or like the history of ideas in philosophy. You pick this up. I think the most easily read book that kind of goes over this to a certain degree would be Ed Fazer's The Last Superstition. very polemical, I'm gonna have to admit, but like it'll familiarize you with some concepts, and then you can go do a deeper dive later. But he gives a
This
similar kind
this
of account
is
where you have
this is what again? Ed Phaser?
Ed Phaser's less superstition.
Last
This is
superstition.
like
Okay.
it's the easiest, like with someone with no background knowledge, it's something that you can easily pick up, but it is very polemical, and he says it out of the gate. But it's the easiest graspable. You'll get familiarized with certain things, and you can go off from there.
I am Ed
But
Phaser, famous Thomist. Here I am to tell you.
right.
But yeah.
But what the basic account is that you have a realist account and understanding of the universe going from like Aristotle to St. Thomas Aquinas in that vein of philosophy. Then you have a certain divergence, and this is a similar narrative that you pick up in Michelle Allen Gillespie's book, Theological Origins of Modernity, where you get certain. You actually also get it in John Milbank's stuff as well. Slightly different, but still. But you get a kind of, I'm not going to say divergence, but there's a certain shift or uh, creations in medieval philosophy, and it's usually pinned down to someone like I'm pretty sure it's Scotus, and I'm forgetting the other one off the top of my head. Uh, this is also very simplistic, even.
Um,
There's there's some issues that can be picked up with, but you get the emergence of voluntarism or nominalism, and then those little seeds then start to grow later on, and then it has a kind of little bit of a tumbling effect. And when you get to Descartes, is you get this kind of like his little bit of his revolution is putting epistemology before metaphysics, where he's going to sort of conjure up in his meditations a very radical form of skepticism that no one really would have taken all that seriously. But he's like, no, I want the absolute perfect certainty of certain things. If I can doubt it at all, I'm going to keep stepping back until I find something I can build absolute solid knowledge on. And then that's where you get cognito ergo sum.
right.
But in the process of that, what he gets as well is a kind of separation of spirit and matter, where he has res extensa, which is the physical material realm, but the cognitus. Might be getting the pronunciations wrong, but that's fine.
Right.
Which
Which
is sort of like
which
immaterial conscious matter or immaterial conscious substance.
which gives
Uh,
birth to the sort of modern
mm-hmm.
problems with mind body in
Right.
philosophy
Yeah.
and neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh, but then what this
It's
also
all
does is
Descartes' fault.
yeah, it's like I said, it's a kind of narrative. I'm a little iffy on it, but it has some water. I will admit I hold to it a certain degree, but it's always very reserved. But that's an entirely different subject. But what you get with this kind of Descartes as being a starting point, and as we go through with the coming into modernity, uh, is this very transcendental kind of quality where you have, okay, here's the material stuff, and this is totally mechanistic, and we can study it, and then like you control it, yada yada yada, and then everything else is kind of stored somewhere else in this immaterial substance, but they're broadly separated. Uh, you get this same kind of thing with the certain theological developments where we're heightening God's transcendence way, way above his immanence to almost a certain point where it breaks, and then that's when faith starts to get a little bit difficult. At least that's a claim that you're going to pick up in something like, I think it's going to be in Theological Origins of Modernity, but don't quote me on it. So it's a certain account of certain thinkers and ideas that then progress through the ages and then kind of hit a point where things become far too difficult. So that's why he's saying that Nietzsche kind of declares a death of God, but what Nietzsche's actually really declaring is the death of a perversion or a twisting of God, or at least the original understandings. It was the death of this overly transcendental principle that just kind of rules above this mechanistic universe or something to that effect. And then once you lose sight of that and you're unable to touch that anymore because it's just too distant from you, you're positing something that you can't fully grasp. Then you're left with just material mechanistic universe, and then that's when things get a little bit tough for people. To quote Rick Roderick, when man is below God, we understand it because we're made by him and for him with purpose. When man becomes less important than the GameCube, we get confused, and then that's the issue. Like he starts talking about like scientific discoveries and things like genes and finding the fundamental code of the human person. Uh, and he's kind of going like, well, how are scientists going to account for that? What knows the code? Are they going to say the code knows the code and it reduces man to just nothing? So then this is where you get this flattening effect, and this is what Nietzsche was hitting on, where modern progress in science is going to just flatten everything. So then we're going to have a problem of value. So then how do we deal with that? And then that's when he posits the overman. We have to create our own values now. And that's the kind of situation we find ourselves in. This is something that Bruman, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but it's in the book Liquid Modernity, where his little contention is that we're not in post-modernity yet. We're actually in just very late modernity. And it's liquid because we took all that solid, things like essences,
Hmm.
and made it fluid, where now they're just hard to grasp. And it's this creation of a vast multiplicity, and it makes things very confusing.
Yeah,
We can't
I,
grab a hold of things anymore.
I had a professor, an English professor one time, who liked to say that post modernity isn't a thing. You just have modernity and more modernity. I don't know how
Mm-hmm.
true he was about that, but um, it.
That is Bruman or Brauman's thesis,
Mhm.
essentially, is that we haven't overcome modernity yet and entered into a post-modernity. We're just like the things that modernity started off with have now just been intensified. So that's why it's like late modernity or liquid modernity, because he makes a distinction between solid modernity at the beginning, where you could do stuff like imminent critique and critique institutions, or ideas and moralities and certain ethics, because they had solidity to them. And the whole idea was to improve them like they weren't good enough.
Right.
But then you have, through its own internal logic, it's actually all been melted down into liquid and spread out to where this is something that I picked up from it's quote I'm quoting in Nealon Negri, where he's talking about the deconstructionists were pushing against an open door, at least after a certain period. Where it's just actually no, we've entered into a period of so much multiplicity and so much fluidity that you're not deconstructing anything because it's all already deconstructed. It it's all imminent. It's all multiplicity now.
Yeah, it's all
Uh,
slipping through our fingers.
mhm. Yeah, it's where now it's this infinite sort of self. It's this aesthetic self-creation where you have this a billion different kind of identities, and the whole thing about that is like this is a part interacting with capitalism as well. Where in doing this, the its internal logic is create as many markets as possible. So that means create as many identities as possible, as many desires as possible. So then you have this continual force of okay, so the solid of sexual morality or something like an institution like marriage gives way to liquidity to kind of open it up to further kind of markets, further desire, further continual flux and motions. And another upshot of this is acceleration as well, constant flows of information and movement of people, yada yada yada. And that's why you have things like Brauman likes to compare it to like the Middle East. Why aren't certain things picking up there? Is well because you have a very strict moral code that acts as a blocker for the kind of the continual march of capital and market and money, yada yada yada. There's a break there. So it's a basic idea, like it's something that you might think of as woke capital. Why would that exist? It's because, well, guess what? If we make new identities and we kind of remove these kind of barriers, we just have more markets, more things that we can go to. And it needs to happen because we've gone around the whole world. We can't just do basic imperialism anymore and root out a country of raw resources. Like the world's conquered, basically. So then all that's left to do is go down internally, intensification. So that's why things become so fast. Fads happen so quickly. It's this continual reinventing of the same thing over and over again and keep selling it. Like I like to make a little tongue-in-cheek joke of like, if you want to see how far modernity has come, look at the Funko Pop. Like no use value. It's all sign value basically, and you basically consume it as an object of identity. Of here's my little Captain America Funko Pop and my Captain America shirt. It makes you think of American Psycho at the beginning. Of there's a visage of shoot, I'm blanking on his name. What is it? Oh, who's the guy? Who's the guy in American Psycho? What's the character's name?
I've never seen it. I don't know.
Shoot, but it's and I'm also blanking on the actor's name. Okay, whatever. But it's like there's an idea of Patrick Bateman. Yeah, there's an idea of Patrick Bateman, but there's nothing underneath. It's all image. So that's what, like, every time when I look at the Funko Pop, I just keep thinking of that, where this is simply an item, a commodity that I use for identity. Like, it's just a solid figure. Like, and what do you do with it?
Interesting. Well, I don't have anything else to hit. I think there's more that we could talk about, but frankly, it's not our job necessarily to break down the whole book, and there are other things that we could pick up in further live streams. Um,
Mm.
so I think what we could do is go ahead and turn this over to questions for the next 10 minutes or however long people want to go on that, and then I think we will call it a day. How's that sound, guys? One one thing I might say before we go is I did like how Hibbs is not. I really like how Hibbs is not trying to argue that nihilism is sort of the dominant strain of American pop culture, because obviously it isn't. Um, and I do like the counter examples that he brings up at the end of this chapter. So, for example, um, he talks a little bit about the Book of Eli, which personally I find to be an excellent film, and it does dig into what he talks about the whole idea of restoring the idea of life as a quest. It's a quest based off of I can't remember which psalm it is. Psalm 23, I think. Um, we do have a question now. So and this is for Andrew. Will Timothy Norman Johnson, all four of those names. Did Andrew have a main aim in reading this and explaining it to the society? Andrew, would you like to field that one?
It's me being a little sneaky. Uh, Partly because, okay, mea culpa, I'm very frustrated with a lot of trends, just general everywhere, where there's a desire for something. It's a passion of semblance, is what I'm going to call it. Passions for the real again. But then an inability to actually sit there and think it, because it's a general problem, and this is where I'm kind of siding with the Nicholas. That's not his name. Uh, I know the last name, Davila. Kind of a not he didn't write prolifically, but his idea is he's sort of one of the preeminent quote unquote reactionaries. I mean, I can't say quote unquote because he literally referred to himself in this tongue in cheek manner. But his whole thing was that the sign of the true reactionary is reading, and this is because, like, going back to the speed and flows and the constant flux of modern society, it's this turning back to the slowness of reading and contemplation. And this is something that needs to be done because we're kind of being constantly bombarded with speed and confusion. So if you want a way out of it, you actually have to sit there, stop, and go back to thinking. You have to go back to the slowness of thought, go back to the drawing board, because it's very easy to fall for this trap of continual imminent critique saying, here's this conflict in this thing, here's this conflict in that thing, here's this inconsistency here, and then think you're doing something when you actually just sit there and do nothing. Because then someone can just level the question to you. Okay, yes, we've heard your complaints, blah 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 blah. What do you want? How do we go from here? And there's never an answer. This is the kind of, again, that term, the slow cancellation of the future. We actually don't have the, let's call it, the psychic material to come up with a future, a way out, a way through. So this is why I'm very adamant about, you have to stop and think, versus the tendency of the modern world to force you to constantly go tumbling forward in this project of self-creation, this constant feeling of anxiety and urgency, is to actually stop, think, slow down. And this is why this book is very helpful, because everyone kind of wants to talk about culture. It's very easy for people to do. But then at one and the same time, it's this little lead back into contemplation of actually really doing serious thought. So it's a little bit of a bridge to where it'll get you familiar with ideas of nihilism, romanticism, and then you might be able to start investigating those things properly, which requires actually slow, serious, uh, how does it, not constrained, consistent. I'm blanking on the word, but slow thought and actual serious engagement with it.
Excellent. And I believe maybe I'll go ahead and field this question as to why the audiobook is posted to this channel in particular, not the codex. I believe the plan is to eventually migrate the audiobook over to the codex, but given that it is sort of the companion text to these live streams, it will be on this channel alongside the live stream for the duration of our treatment of the work. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's a technical issue where I just got the keys to this channel, uh, and I can use my space age technology to upload it very quickly because I uploaded it in about 45 minutes,
Yeah,
and
because
you it would have
for
it would
some
have
reason
taken you
he
days.
decided for some reason he decided that he needed an hour and 40 minutes of a still image in 1080p.
Yeah, our editor did that, and he said, "Well, it helps with the sound," and I go, "Okay, but it's either I upload it or or we're gonna have a very hot motherboard in your computer or something." I can do
Yeah.
it very easily. So I had to get the keys. I only got the keys to this channel. So whenever I get the keys to the other, I'll migrate.
Speaking of, we're hoping to get the next chapter of shows about nothing up sometime in the middle of this week. Sound good, Andrew? Can we do that?
I haven't started recording it yet, and then there's the editing process. As I'm feeling out, the editing process takes a while because it's mostly me just swearing in my mic, restarting sentences, uh, making the job of the editor harder. So it's fielding this out of getting back into reading out loud, something I'm not used to. Trying to make it a little easier on him, and then maybe it'll go a little faster.
All right, excellent. Um, does anyone have any other questions while we're here? Because if not, we could go ahead and close out. I think this has been a fruitful discussion, and I really like Andrew's rationalization for reading through Hibbs's book here. I do think encouraging slowness and sort of a method to the madness, so to speak, um, is preferable. And I think we're all in the same boat of we want to read more books, we just don't have the time. So,
Mm,
isn't it better when you can listen to the book and then have
right.
people talk about it?
Yeah, this is sort of. I think I'll touch just briefly on. I think a little bit of a confusion that happens nowadays, where it's the idea that reading is this kind of one-way thing, when it really isn't. You should be in this kind of, lack of a better term, communication with the book, engagement. Sometimes it's you only get through a paragraph and then you basically close it and you sit there and chew on it. So it needs to be much slower. And this is again this kind of leaking in the modern society, this constant pressure for speed, creeping into things like reading and contemplation, where you can't let go of it for a moment and go just kind of right. Because what should be happening in the engagement with the text is, and this is very pseudo platonic here, where it should give rise to ideas in you. It's not. It shouldn't be a matter of kind of like this modern educational assembly line logic of I need to memorize this for the text, and that there's this deep pressure. It's like no, just sit there, chew it over, and let it give rise to certain ideas and concepts within. So this is why I'm talking about the slowness and the engagement of a text very slow. This is why I'm very eclectic. I'll jump back between texts, I'll read a couple pages, and I'll actually just go and basically think about it, trying to link it up to a whole bunch of different things. So this is why I think reading is very difficult for people because it's a very uncomfortable thing to do because they're bringing all the baggage of their school days. You need to read this chapter by this time and then answer these questions for this test, and then it screws you up.
hmm
So then actually trying to pick up something like philosophy or theology or any kind of spiritual work. I don't understand how you would be able to read something like Augustine, his Confessions, and read it as if you're training for a test. If you're doing that, you've missed everything. You got to sit there and communicate with it, this back and forth, this slowness of reading. So
All right.
that's, yeah, yeah, just go for it.
Um,
I'll
Ju-
go on forever.
Julio Bravo asks, "What war book do you recommend?" And I'm not going to read his second post there. Um, in terms of military fiction, I don't know if I have any particular favorites. I don't read a lot of military fiction. I used to read Tom Clancy novels, but I mostly read the ones dealing with espionage. One of my favorite Tom Clancy novels actually was Red Rabbit. I don't know if anyone's ever read that, but that's about it's about the this Soviet code operator, signal operator guy who gets word of the Soviet plan to assassinate John Paul II, and he defects from the Soviet Union in time to give the Allies the goods to save John Paul II. It's an interesting book. It's not, obviously, it's not necessarily factual, but it's interesting nonetheless. Um, uh, you know, another interesting, it's not necessarily a war book, but I really liked in terms of like I like pulp science fiction stuff a lot, and the John Carter of Mars novels were really fun to read, and they're sort of military-ish. In the sense that they deal with warfare and conflict, but other than that, I don't really read a lot of military fiction. Andrew, is that something you do?
No, not really. If I read anything that's sort of fictional, or I guess enjoyment reading, I don't even know what to call it. It's usually
Pleasure
stuff
reading.
that's, yeah, even my pleasure reading never touches on fantasy or anything like that. But if I'm doing anything in that vein, it's usually stuff that's tragedy. And this goes back to like a deep skepticism of mine of idyllic heroic fantasies. Like, I'm actually not a big fan of Lord of the Rings. I can't get through it. Like, it's something about me. I have a deep skepticism towards it for some odd reason. I mean, I have reasons for it, but it's a different topic.
Well, Andrew, you're officially ejected from the stream. You're not allowed to come here anymore.
No, like my favorite fantasy series is gonna be like Elric and Melniboné, where it's this like slow following of a guy whose vices is his absolute undoing.
So
It's like there,
here's
that's where I get my moral lessons from, is what not to do versus trying to have an idyllic character that no one really matches up to. Is like, oh, here's someone who's deeply flawed, and his hubris leads to his downfall. Like
so
that's the stuff I dig.
so the next stream is going to be me telling Andrew why he's wrong about the Lord of the Rings.
It's
Um,
it's literally just me and my taste and like a deep skepticism for it.
Yeah, it isn't for everyone. Usually my sort of shit test to see if like someone would like really like the Lord of the Rings the way I do is if they like Beowulf or like Anglo-Saxon poetry or mythology, because there's a lot of bleed there.
Hmm.
Um,
I mean,
and
okay, when we're saying Lord of the Rings, are we counting the Silmarillion? Because that's something I jive more with.
no, I don't count the Silmarillion. I haven't read the
Yeah,
Silmarillion.
I
So
don't think anyone has, honestly.
yeah, has anyone actually read the Silmarillion? It's
How big is that thing?
it's pretty big. I feel like the
Yeah.
Silmarillion is kind of like the Bible in the sense that everyone would like to read all the way through it, but usually
Uh-huh.
you just read selections.
Yeah, it's Tolkien creating an entire history of the world. He's a historian being a historian creating a history of something.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Tolkien's just he's an interesting guy, and of course I like Lord of the Rings for sort of emotional and aesthetic reasons more than necessarily like philosophical reasons, I suppose. Um, But I think we'll take one more question, and then I think we'll call it for the night. If there is a question to take, that is. So we'll give you guys another couple of minutes. Um, and Dune is better than Star Wars. That is true. That's a true opinion. Although I will say the Isaac Asimov Foundation series, which is very much Star Wars esque, but better. It's Star Wars better. So if you like the concept of Star Wars but don't necessarily like its execution, you might be interested in the Asimov Foundation novels. Although there is one of the beginning novels. I think it's the first novel. There's this whole plot point about these super advanced scientist people who like make a religion because all these dumb rubes follow them because they have advanced technology and they think they're gods or whatever. And that was a dumb plot point, but thankfully it's only a small portion of the first novel. So, any updates on those essay contestants? Andrew, I believe we have a winner for the first essay contest, do we not?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I think we generally decide. At least out of the people who are even gonna bother to read them, like it was stated the mod staff would read them. I think we only got 2 or 3 people who've read them, and there's a general broad.
I'm sorry, you're cutting out. What?
No, I think out of the 3 people who I think did any reading of the essays, there's a broad consensus of one.
Okay, can we announce the winner?
Yeah, Pseudopilled.
All
I think
right,
that's his name.
Pseudopilled, and the title of the winning essay was what?
I think it was very. I have to open it up. I closed them all after I decided. But
Okay, well, we will announce the title of the winning essay as well. It's my fault. I sprang this on him. But yes, and we will be looking forward to having Pseudopilled on either the next live stream or the live stream afterwards to discuss his essay. Because that was the reward. That was one of the rewards, anyway, other than just bragging rights.
I'm pretty sure it was just called making a change. If I'm looking at it right. No, wait. No, that's the wrong one. Nope, that's not it. Shoot, where did it go? Actually, I can just check in the server. Why am I looking on the hard drive?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. Let's
Uh,
see. Content submissions. That's where it is.
and for any of you interested who
No, no, it is making a change. I was looking for a name up in the corner. He didn't do that. No,
okay.
yeah, it's called making a change. That's it.
Right. So we want to officially declare the winner of the first essay contest for the Canis Society is Pseudopilled, and his essay "Making a Change." So we hope to have him on soon, and we are currently running a contest for narrative essays or narrative fiction in general. I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
very very broad. It's narrative fiction.
okay.
That whole neck of the woods.
So we are running a contest for narrative fiction, and same sort of deal. Whoever wins the contest, we will invite on the stream to discuss their submission. But congratulations to Pseudopilled and his winning essay, and we hope to have him on soon. Um, and I think that's going to do it for us, folks. So I hope you guys have a great rest of the evening. Uh, just enjoy your time under quarantine. uh, and uh, and like I said, have a great rest of the night. God bless, and goodbye.